In this video, we're going to talk about 3 chord progressions that teach essential songwriting skills. The first chord progression we're going to talk about is a 1-5-3-4 chord progression. In the context of C major, this would be C major, G major, E minor, F major. Now, one takeaway is just that the lift from a 3 to a 4 chord is just really pretty and pretty awesome. Maybe my favorite chord transition that there is, but that's not the foundational takeaway. The foundational takeaway is more about leading tones and how that impacts music. Now, the reason that the 3 chord really wants to go to that 4 chord and it's so smooth and it feels just right is at least partially the same reason that a 5 chord really badly wants to go to a 1 chord. And that is with the very important concept that is leading tones. A leading tone is simply a note that resolves by a half step. So if you take any major scale, let's take C major, we have C, D, E, F. There's a half step. And then G, A, B, and then a half step back to C. So the 2 half steps we have is between the 3 and the 4 and the 7 and back to the 1. Now, very often when people think of leading tones, they think of the 7 that really wants to go to the 8. And that's because this is the most common and most important leading tone we have. And this is why a 5 chord, which has that 7, really wants to resolve to the 1 because it has that 7 to 1 leading tone. But a 3 chord to a 4 chord actually has the same leading tone, but it also utilizes the other leading tone in a major key, which is the 3 to the 4. So when we take the 3 chord and then just get rid of the 3rd, just because it doesn't really make our point right now, if we just break it down to the E and the B, the 1st and the 5th, and then we go to the 4 chord and break that down just into the 1st and the 5th, the B resolves up to a C. So the B operates as a leading tone into the C. But also the E resolves to the F. So it's actually using both leading tones at the same time, which is why it feels so smooth and so right, even though it's a 3 chord going to a 4 chord, which is not something you'd probably think of when you think of a chord transition that just sounds really smooth. So there is great power in just thinking about leading tones and how much a leading tone wants to resolve where it wants to resolve to. So our 7 wants to resolve to the 8, or back to the 1, because 8 is the same as 1. And in this case, a 3 also wants to really resolve to a 4. And a 3 to a 4 chord takes advantage of both of those leading tones we have. So the main takeaway is don't underestimate leading tones in general. It's not just for 5 chords going back to 1 chords where they can be really helpful and important. And a lot of times we think of just the 1 leading tone, the 7 back to the 1. But also the 3 to 4 can be another really powerful leading tone that just isn't talked about nearly enough. The next chord progression we're going to talk about is a 1-5-flat-7-4-5 chord progression, which in the context of C major would be C major, G major, B flat major, F major, G major. And the takeaway from this is really just the beauty and richness that we can get from chromaticism, because primarily what gives this its distinct sound is that it has some chromaticism. We go C, B, B flat, A. So we have 4 notes in a row that are a part of a chromatic scale. And a part of the beauty of chromaticism is it tends to really build tension in a pretty and unexpected way, because almost always to have chromaticism, you have to do something outside of the key, such as utilize a borrowed chord like we have in this progression. Because in this progression, we have just the 1 chord, and then the 5 chord, which for the record, I'm putting in first inversion, just to really hammer home that chromaticism. So we have the 1 chord, 5 chord, and then we actually borrow a flat 7 chord from the Mixolydian mode. You don't necessarily have to understand that part, but we're borrowing that chord from the Mixolydian mode. And then we go back to just a regular F major chord, which is just a regular 4 chord in the context of C major, and then back to a G major chord, which is just a 5 chord in the context of C major. And essentially you could sort of think of this like we add an unexpected chord in the midst of a very expected and normal, really honestly very common chord progression in a 1, 5, 4, 5 chord progression. But in this case, we're doing the 1, the 5, and then we borrow a chord before we go down to that 4 chord, and then back to a 5 chord. So just that one borrowed chord that adds that chromaticism can really dial up the tension and create a lot of intrigue. So just know that chromaticism is an incredibly powerful tool, and also it's a great way to get into altered and borrowed chords, because a really easy way to get a borrowed or altered chord to work in the context of your song is to utilize it in order to get chromaticism, like we did here, where we have the 1, the 5, and then we choose to borrow a chord that gets us that chromaticism. And then we just continue with the chromaticism. So that chromaticism is what really helped that borrowed chord to work. Another chord progression we can learn from is a 1, 4, major 2, 5 chord progression. In the context of C major, this would be C major, F major, D major, G major. And the essential songwriting skill this teaches us is about secondary dominants and their power to sort of pull us forward through the song. These secondary dominants also give this sense of anticipation, and it allows us to tonicize chords that aren't actually the tonic. That was a lot of words. Let me explain that very quickly. So the tonic is really just your musical center of gravity. So in the key of C major, the tonic is C major. So C major, F major, G major, that's the tonic. That sound of resolve and hum. So when we say that we tonicize another chord other than the 1, we essentially give another chord the gift of operating like it is the tonic, even if for a brief moment. A secondary dominant is essentially when you have a 5-1 transition, but the 5 is coming from a chord outside of the key of your song, and the 1 is a chord in your song that isn't actually the 1. So if we go back to the chord progression we're talking about, we have a 1, 4, and then that major 2 we talked about, which has an F sharp in it. This isn't C major. There's no F sharp in C major. But we have this major 2, which is a D major chord, which is not naturally occurring in C major. Normally it would be a D minor chord. But we have D major, and then we go to the 5 chord, which is G major. But what's interesting is, in the context of C major, usually G major really wants to go to 1. And it actually still does. But we gave G major essentially the gift of it getting to operate sort of as a tonic, because we go from D major to G major. And D major is the 5 chord for G major, right? So if you're in the context of G major, and if G major were the tonic of the key, then the 5 chord that really wants to resolve to that 1 chord is D major. So we borrow D major so that we tonicize G major, and then we go to our actual tonic. So we essentially have the 5 of our 5 chord, then our 5 chord, and then our 1 chord. So instead of just a 5-1, which is pretty great, we essentially have a 5-1 that then is the beginning of another 5-1, because we essentially have 5-1, but wait, this is not actually a 1 chord. This is actually the 5 chord of our 1. Now, a great application for secondary dominants, and one of the most common ones, is especially if you want to change keys. If you wanted to change from C major to G major, a great way to do that is transition to G major by using the secondary dominant. So starting with C major, now transitioning to G major. So now it feels resolved on G major, even though we started the chord progression in C major. So it can be a great way to change keys. And then it also can be used, of course, in many other ways where you just want to dial up the tension and the anticipation. You want to add a borrowed chord in a way that it works. But the takeaway is secondary dominants can be really powerful and also are something for sure that we as songwriters should have in our tool belt. So these 3 chord progressions taught us 3 essential songwriting skills in understanding leading tones and utilizing them, as well as understanding the power of chromaticism and utilizing that, and how it can help us to more naturally use altered and borrowed chords. And also, last but certainly not least, the importance of and the power of secondary dominance and being able to tonicize any chord that we want within our key for a certain effect, or to really add some anticipation, or even just as a great tool for key changes, as secondary dominants are the easy 1 chord way to seamlessly switch keys. Hopefully this video was helpful to you. If it was, be sure to check out my free keys cheat sheet. It breaks down every single note and every main chord you have in every key. So if you want to write a song in G major, it just gives you, here are the notes to use, here are the chords to use, go ahead. And it does that for every key. So be sure to check that out, songwritertheory.com/keys. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Talk to you in the next one.